My name is Bruner. I'm the third of the set of lectures from CI. I'm going to talk a bit about the potential utility of looking at protected areas from an economic perspective. You all are probably quite familiar with the fairly rancorous debate around protected areas, with people on one side calling for 50% of the earth to be covered in protected areas and people on the other talking about conservation as a major source of ecological refugees, and big economic claims somewhere in the middle. And what I'm going to try to do is talk a bit about how a more rational economic look at protected areas can offer some insight into how to think about protected areas. Thank you. As a way to promote the public good for various reasons, and I'll get into what I mean by that. How do I advance?
You got it.
Oh, good. All right. I'm going to do four things. The first is to fairly briefly give a bit of a justification for why it might be useful to use economics to think about protected areas. The majority of the talk will be based on looking at two sort of technical issues and the implications they have. The first of those is comparison of benefit to cost, how you do it and what kind of comes out of thinking about it like that. And the second one is the issue of market failure and the implications of that for protected area strategies. And I'll end very briefly by talking a bit about some of the potentially important themes that this suggests going forward. As you're all aware, protected areas over time have been created for quite a broad number of reasons. Those range from clean water provision to tourism to simply protecting the natural heritage of a place for our kids or for our grandkids. At the same time, protected areas have also, in many cases, been opposed by somebody. And this is certainly the case in the era of protected areas since they've gone from being simple taboo sites or sacred groves to a management structure that crosses multiple people, multiple interests, multiple rights. And it's worth noting that's quite simply, I think, because they have costs. Those include the direct cost of protected area management. They include the cost often of human-wildlife conflict, and the challenge of having to stop killing something that's eating your crops is not something that should be overlooked. They include issues like lost access to natural resources, although there's a sustainability question in there that we should get into a bit. They have included certainly issues of displacement, and there are sort of horrific cases of people being displaced from protected areas. And then they include in every case, just like with any resource decision, a foregone opportunity and opportunity cost. That is what you can't do with the area because you're protecting it. And I've included, I think you can see it, but a sort of a cover shot of a neat paper by Paul Ferraro and Laura Taylor on the subject of opportunity cost, which is kind of a quick and fun read about that and how economists don't understand it well enough. And the point to bring out here is that if you look at, for example, a given protected area, and you look at the actors that benefit from it and that pay for it at different scales, say a local scale, a national scale, and a global scale, the benefits and the costs that they each receive are very different. So these are just illustrative, but you can see that they aren't the same. And a couple of really important generalities can be drawn out of this. The first is that very often costs are focused while benefits are dispersed. The classic sort of case, this would be carbon. A community or a government has to pay the opportunity cost of not using a forest for logging or for agriculture if they want to protect the carbon value. That's something that the global community benefits from. Another sort of common generality here is that costs are often short-term, while benefits are longer term. This would be the case, for example, in creating a marine protected area to manage fisheries. We're asking, in that case, for fishermen to forego a catch in the present, presumably for a greater catch in the future. And the final, perhaps not so common, but important generality to draw out is that costs are very often quite a bit more palpable than the benefits. So if a lion kills your cow, and it's one of your 3 cows, or if a monkey eats your crop, that's an immediate fiasco, and it's much more palpable, even if the value in economic terms is sort of the same, than all the little bees that are fertilizing the grass that the cow eats and all the beetles that are digesting the nitrogen. Anyway, so it's perceived differently, even if the sort of economic number adds up. And what economics offers is a way to sort of dissect all that, not just to understand the numbers and how they stack up, but how they're perceived, how they play out over time, which ones come through the market, and to understand how to deal with that reality. So jumping to the first of these technical themes, I mentioned that there were two. I'll talk first a bit about this issue of how to do a sort of fair evaluation of benefits to cost for protected areas, and then I'll review some of the sort of headline numbers that come out of doing that from the TEEB report. From the technical side, I think maybe I'll emphasize 2 points. There are probably others, but the first Somewhat obviously is the need to compare comparable things. This is somewhat easier at a site scale where it's possible, and people have done this in a few cases, to look at benefits and costs together in the same place. That is where the people are the same, the alternatives are the same, the change in the deforestation rate that you're going to achieve through protection is the same. That's a good way to generate a truly comparable number. Taking that from a site to, say, a national scale is challenging if you don't have a representative sample of the sites in a country, and there aren't places where that exists. And so people looking to do more global things or more national things have done a bit of using the site and guessing about how it extrapolates, but also the second thing, which is to look at summary or average values, not necessarily from the same place, but with the idea that if you take enough from enough places, you perhaps overcome some of the bias of just taking kind of one cost from one place and one benefit from another. And I'll give you examples of each of these as we go along. And the final thing, and I think this is quite worth noting, is to learn from what's already happened. That is to look at how well off people are in and around protected areas versus not in and around protected areas, and control for other things like market access. And so rather than going through the sort of economics of what benefits and what costs are there, to just try to understand the state and the outcome. And there's something to be learned from that as well. The second sort of set of points here is the importance of working at the margin. And I don't know how many of you are economists, but I mean that in the economic sense of the word. That is the difference in, for example, a certain amount of investment in a protected area, the marginal difference of adding one more unit of that or taking it away, rather than something that's sort of working on something that's irrelevant, which is maybe the common understanding of that word. And in that area are sort of 3 points to add. One is the need to be careful extrapolating. The thing that got some of the people's hackles raised when Bob Costanza published his sort of seminal work in 1997 about ecosystem services, was that he'd extrapolated from site-specific values to the sum total of areas that might include, that might have those services. So say from 1 kilometer of beach, which may have a $50 value of tourism, to all the beach in all the world, which should have $50 times the total number. And that there's a potential error there, because those services can go up or down, depending on how the pattern looks. The second point to sort of bring out here in regard to the margin is the need to include ecosystem services from the productive landscapes. One of the sort of easy things to overlook is to sort of say protected areas have the following ecosystem services and production landscapes have the following production, and that's the comparison. But in reality, there's quite a bit of value of ecosystem service from production landscapes as well, and it's important to take that into account. And the final point here, I think, is at the very least to be transparent about the difference between total and marginal value. I have sort of a bias here about thinking that total value is actually sort of a deceptive thing to say and at all, but to at the very least be transparent about it. And just to sort of break that down a bit, total value of a protected area, as you know, could be broken apart into a bunch of pieces, perhaps extraction of some forest products, perhaps recreation, perhaps downstream water services, perhaps some biodiversity conservation, and you could categorize those according to their piece of total economic value or to the type of ecosystem service they are. And if you do that, come up with that total number, you can make a statement about how much protected areas are contributing to social welfare. What you can't do with that statement is say it's good to invest in protected areas, because you don't know that. You don't know whether your investment would change the flow of benefits. You don't know what would happen to the other sorts of services or other sources of well-being from that landscape. To do that, you need to go a step farther and you need to get towards marginal value. Marginal, again, meaning incremental, not irrelevant. And so you can potentially learn about a couple of different things here. First, to understand what would happen to a landscape without your intervention, and hypothetically here, services would go down. That's the value of degradation, and that tells us whether there's something to worry about in the first place. If nothing would happen if you didn't invest, there's pretty little justification for investing. So it's also worth understanding what would happen if you did invest. That is, presumably, again, in this hypothetical case, an increase in values of some kinds at least, and an associated cost, which showed up on the bottom. That's the value of conservation. It's the net of those two things that can tell you whether conservation is a good investment. Again, a marginal thing, not a total thing. And just to sort of belabor this point a bit, if you have benefits in the future without conservation, benefits in the future with conservation, you can start to break apart the net change. That is, some services will go up, recreation in this case, water services in this case, value of biodiversity conservation itself. Some things will go down. In this case, there may be less extraction from forest products, and there'll be some direct costs, in this case, the cost of management. And it's that net of the gross benefits of conservation minus the opportunity cost minus the costs that lets you say, not only is conservation a good thing, we can invest in it, it has a positive return, but it's better than the alternative. And that ultimately is the thing that's most useful to decision makers. And I won't belabor this point too much, but it's worth noting that this is a more complex thing to do. It requires you to know changes. What happens to ecosystem as you invest more, what happens to service flow as a system changes, what happens to the other things coming from that system as you improve the conservation. And that's a more data intensive thing unless you make quite a bit of assumption. And I'll leave that there, but if there are questions, we can come back to it. So with that sort of background, I'll review now a bit the sort of headline numbers, again, coming out of TEEB and a few other places at the sort of global, national, and local scale. The first number, the one that's sort of still most commonly cited at the global scale, is one that's now almost 10 years old, and that's from Andrew Balmford and a few other people who costed two things. They costed an expanded protected area system that's worked by Alex James, now also very old, and they estimated benefits of that system based on per hectare values from Bob Costanza, the same ones that were criticized. They made an adjustment to that to deal with this marginal issue, which was to look at all the studies that existed at that time, which were about 5, I think, that compared benefits of conservation and benefits of production in the same place, and made sure to include the ecosystem service value of production as well. So that is, address that piece of the margin, not make the error of assuming that there's no value of service in production landscapes. And they found that ratio was something like 2 to 1, and so they adjusted down the total value of benefits from 9 trillion down to about 4. That's the way they made that correction. The other issue of marginality, extrapolating from a marginal value to a whole, wasn't addressed here. We took another swing at this in TEEB using basically newer data from the Stern report and TEEB's update of the per hectare values on average, and came out in developing countries in the areas of active deforestation with about 25 to 1 as the ratio of benefit to cost. So probably just to avoid sort of skipping over this, a logical question could be, is it reasonable these things could coexist together and be different? And I think probably there's two ways to think about that. One would be to say that neither one is attempting to be correct. They're both sort of generalizations from broad data. And so in that context, to me, they're actually not that far off, even though they're different from each other. They're both making the general case that this is a good investment. And the other would be to say that protected areas, as has been sort of revealed by a bunch of research in the past decade, are preferentially located out of areas of active deforestation. That is where the opportunity cost is lower. And that too would imply that the cost-benefit ratio would be higher in areas of active deforestation. Anyway, so something to think about in thinking about whether those are can reasonably exist together. So moving to the national scale, you can do two things here, and I thought about this a bit. One of them is to sort of adjust those Balmford et al. Numbers to take out the piece of the benefits that's global, and we did some of that for TEEB. I think probably the more useful way to think about this is to say that doing that suggests that this is still probably a good investment on average. But as you get anywhere away from the global scale, I think it's much more useful to sort of think about case evidence and think about particular cases. It doesn't do a hell of a lot of good to say, on average, countries are this much better off if they have a protected area system, because they need their actual data. And so I'll just review a couple of cases. And again, that's the point we can come back to if anyone's interested in it. One is I think, quite a pioneering study by Jean-Christophe Carré in Madagascar, which looked at an expansion of the national protected area system, basically to hilltops, remaining forest types, and found that for the country, investment in protected area would generate a 50% return above the costs. And that would come in the form of water, avoided damage to irrigated agriculture down the slopes, increased international payment for the protected area system, a big assumption, but part of this analysis. And I'm not sure what else. And cost, on the other hand, would come in terms of foregone agricultural expansion up the hills. Some similar work was done in Scotland. This is costing the Natura 2000 targets, which you guys may know of. Those are basically the European Union's set of sort of joint targets for an integrated protected area system. This work in Scotland found that the benefit to the Scottish public, not globally because that's higher, but the benefit to the Scottish public was about 3 times higher than the investment at the level of Scotland. Again, so a positive cost-benefit ratio. And there is a but here, and the example at the bottom actually is a case example from a site rather than a national study, but it's relevant. There are other cases where if you take out the piece of benefits that are global and no one pays for them, then you get a flop and it becomes not in the national best interest to do protected areas. The major benefit type in the analysis in Paraguay, by far and away was the carbon value. And if you remove that from the analysis, far and away agriculture becomes a better choice for Paraguay. And that gets to the issue of whether or not people are actually paying for these services that benefit the global community, and I'll get into that too. At the local scale, I think it's fair to say that generalizations are probably even less useful. And the reason why is if you look at, again, at this chart, if you look at what kinds of benefits and what kinds of costs could accrue to local actors, whether they be the maintenance of this is sort of sustainability of consumptive resource uses, whether they be a whole other set of potential local ecosystem services, whether they be cultural and spiritual values, on the benefit side and on the cost side, the whole set practically are possible. All of them are dependent on where protected areas go and how they're managed. And so I think, again, sort of trying to make a generic statement about protected areas being a good thing locally or a bad thing locally is perhaps less useful than simply trying to understand how we can make sure that we tip the balance so that benefits are greater than costs. And that, I think, is probably a good segue to the second bit of this talk. But before I do that, I sort of wanted to pause. I'm conscious of talking at you guys too much, and also it may be a good spot for questions. Is there any clarifying questions about that would be useful before we go to the rest? And if they reflect the last part of the lecture, I'll just keep going. But if there are any questions, I'd be happy to try to address them. Or not. Okay. All right. Good. Okay. So like I said, that issue of sort of working on trying to make sure benefits are greater than costs is a good segue to this issue of market failure, and that's the second bit of the talk. Market failure and its implications for protected area strategies, or the second substantive bit. The theoretical basis for this, as you guys probably know, is that markets function well as a system for allocating among scarce things in some contexts. They function really well for producers deciding how to produce something. They function really well in the hypothetical example of someone choosing between buying another t-shirt and another candy bar. They function poorly in the case of many environmental issues, and not just environmental issues, but a lot of other social issues as well. And that's a broad field, but some of the most relevant reasons why that happens are listed here, and I'll actually go into these in some detail in the rest. But just to sort of start off, inadequate information, for example, if you're a farmer and you don't know that bees help pollinate your crop, or you don't know the value of it, and you don't know that they live in the forest fringe that you've kept because it's sort of rocky and not fertile, you don't manage for that. It doesn't enter into your sort of calculation about how you're going to use your land. And as a result, you make a decision typically, which is to clear that when and if that becomes economically viable, independent of whether or not your crop production is going to suffer, because you don't know. Consumers can also sort of have information failures. Some really neat work was done by Ian Bateman and his colleagues studying whether people would be willing to pay more for oil palm, for their margarine, I think in that case, for oil palm products, if they knew that it protected tigers better, and found that they would. And the point there is that consumers don't know that, by and large. They don't know that their margarine has a negative impact on tigers, and because they don't know that, they don't pay more, even though they'd be willing to pay more. And because of that, the people in a position to produce don't produce that way, because they don't get a price premium for it. Another information failure. And just to sort of offer perhaps a less intuitive one, Australia, as some of you might know, has been quite keen to start an industry in kangaroo meat export. That's something that the world has been quite negative on. And the reason is because oh my God, we can't eat kangaroos. They're these beautiful things. But that turns out to be quite information failure, because kangaroos are very well suited to Australia. They can be managed sustainably. The meat is healthy. Australia has great working models for how to manage kangaroos. Are you from Australia? My office mate is from Australia, and that's where this came from. So. But anyway, and the result of that, though, is that Australia then ends up stocking its rangeland with other things that are much less well suited to the ecosystem. They have a big negative impact. And again, it's an information failure because people sort of think, oh no, horrible disaster to kangaroos to eat them. You end up with this bad feedback that affects ultimately resource use decisions. The second type of market failure that I'll get into a bit, and I won't talk about it here, but I just want to flag it, is this issue of poorly defined or not enforceable property rights. This gets quite a bit to the issue of the commons, which is one that I won't talk about. It's covered much more effectively by other people, but there are a few issues that I want to bring out, so I'm just flagging it now. And the last one is to talk a bit about externalities and public goods. Negative externalities being, let me make sure I get this right, being damage done by people who don't pay the cost for it, and positive externalities being cases where potential providers of a positive thing aren't sharing in the benefit of it. Both of those things sort of systematically result in over or under production of the thing. And public goods being those which people can neither be excluded from nor which my enjoyment of them can exclude other people's enjoyment of them or diminishes. And the classic characteristic of a public good is that you free ride. You have very little real incentive to pay because your piece of the investment is small. You don't perceive that your investment will have a marginal difference. And that's the case in everything from sort of service in the army to clean air. And certainly the case for many environmental goods and services, carbon being an obvious example, although that's now sort of being addressed to some degree as a sort of a major negative externality around the world. And the existence value of biodiversity, the thing which many conservation groups have been sort of most concerned with, even if they weren't using the economic term. That too is in many ways a public good, and one which people are, over time, very unwilling to kind of continually pay for, even if they like the idea of it. Looking at protected areas like this offers, I think, a really interesting opportunity to tie into what's actually quite a well-developed sort of bit of thinking with an accepted terminology, and in fact acceptance theoretically across quite a wide spectrum of people, ranging from fairly conservative to fairly liberal. And in particular, it offers two things to us, I think, that are really useful. One is a standard set of intervention types, as well as justification for them and understanding of how to apply them to deal with problems. Those are regulations, tax subsidies, and market creation. And I'll get into relevant examples in a minute. And they also offer, and I think this is really interesting, some sort of a checklist to double check the logic of our interventions. So thinking about what market failures might be at play in a given place is potentially really useful. A classic error might be to say, look, I know ecosystem services are important. I'm going to enter this place and provide a lot of information, and by demonstrating that the place is important, conservation will happen. But if you don't think about, for example, externalities or public goods and people transacting the values where the benefits and costs are in different places, the thing doesn't work. So again, perhaps just a useful checklist to keep in mind. I'm going to now go through actually each one of these market failures and give a few examples of sort of work that's been done to deal with them. And I think it's probably worth the caveat that these aren't necessarily the best technically examples of doing this. They're chosen to bring out key issues more than anything else. And so there may be some technical issues that you want to point out, but the idea is to use them to sort of tease out things that should be considered. In the area of improving information, and these are actually the results of this study by Carré and Loyer that I mentioned before from Madagascar. I think we unavoidably need to be talking about valuation, but not just valuation, also trade-offs. That is, again, that marginal issue. Protected areas are good, but are they better than the next thing? You need to know that too. And you also need to know about distribution of benefits and costs. And even just sort of a quick look at how this shakes out makes pretty clear that there's a major problem brewing here. So even though a protected area system expansion might be a good thing, even for Madagascar as a whole, which is perhaps the level at which the president is thinking about it as he talks, not the president now, president at the time, as he talks about an expansion. There's a major group here that potentially suffers a huge loss, and that's the poorest group of people in the country. That's the slash and burn farmers that are going to become prohibited from moving upslope into what are actually quite marginal areas for agriculture, but the only thing that they have because of their agricultural form. So information to be aware of and also to have to deal with if you want both an equitable sort of result and an effective protected area system. I thought I'd take a little bit of time to talk in a bit of detail about one analysis looking at sort of cost benefits of a protected area expansion. And as I said, this isn't one of the best technically, but it covers the issues. This is done by a couple of colleagues. And it's the cost benefit analysis of a protected area expansion in the Atlantic forest. Done fairly quickly, done to sort of just get a sense of the issues. For those of you that don't know, this is a relatively wealthy area, especially in the sort of developing country context. And it's one that's quite heavily fragmented. Something like 7% of the Atlantic forest's original cover is intact. That is, there's quite a lot of agricultural production, quite a big need for reforestation, and that's another piece of this scenario that I'm not going to get into. So what was done here was to break this out into two scenarios, again, like I mentioned, to try to work a bit at the margin. One sort of business as usual scenario, that is no new protected areas, and one sort of green scenario, green development being the sort of term that was in use at the time, which comprised itself of 22 new or expanded protected areas. And the key sort of driver for the marginal difference in benefits and costs of this is a change in the historical deforestation rate. The historical deforestation rate here was about 43%. There's obvious mistakes in simply assuming that's the rate that will continue to the future, but that was done for this purpose. And what was assumed then was that protected areas would decrease that by some amount. That too is an assumption. There's no sort of rule floating around for how much protected areas decrease deforestation for a given amount of investment. An area for future work, certainly. But I think maybe just sort of driven on case examples, driven on some rigorous studies that try to be sort of careful of their methodology, it's not unrealistic to think that a well-managed, high-profile system of protected areas could reduce deforestation by 75%. Anyway, we can talk about that too if someone wants. A whole range of data collected, critically for this purpose, agricultural data, forestry data, livestock data, to try to understand opportunity cost. Carbon density data relevant to some of the environmental values. This is sort of the framework for analysis. I wouldn't necessarily tend to do it like this, but it doesn't particularly matter. The point is to sort of break apart the potential benefits and the potential cost and pick the ones you're going to be able to deal with. And I think the sort of standard thing that's tended to happen is for logistical reasons, for cost reasons, for a bunch of reasons, typically most of the costs are able to be covered, and some sort of a fewer set of the benefits can be covered. That's both a technical problem and a practical one. And in this case, the benefits that were covered were two: carbon and something to do with enhanced biodiversity, which isn't well circled. And I'll get into why it's something to do with rather than exactly that. And then the set of costs, management, and the opportunity cost. In the area of protected area benefits, as I said, two things calculated. One, the value of avoided carbon emission, parameterized at $7 a ton, and that's the sort of prevailing price at that time and perhaps now in the voluntary market. Reduced by a 20% buffer because that's what's happening in these sorts of transactions. That is, an investor in one of these things wants to be sure that even when you mess up by some amount for how effective your protected area is, she still is getting her money's worth out of their carbon investment. And the second one, something to do with enhanced biodiversity, and the reason it's something to do with is that value came from a willingness to pay study conducted on residents of Sao Paulo for their willingness to pay for the continuation of a particular protected area, Morro do Diabo. And the motivations that people gave varied. They were leisure, air quality, water, research, not overlapping with carbon, but not all strictly sort of the non-use set either. So it's sort of hard to say what this means, other than that it's probably a component and not overlapping with the carbon component. And the methodology used to take this site number and extrapolate it to the broad area was very simply to assume that people in this region are generally about that willing to pay that much. Or more to the point, they get at least that amount of benefit from new protected areas. Another assumption. On the side of costs, we looked at the two obvious ones: management cost, which is something like $7.50 per hectare per year on the highest scale, but these are small protected areas, and a setup cost up front. We also looked at opportunity cost. For new areas, a one-off timber cost up front, a value of timber up front foregone, and that's something like $250 a hectare once. And for the opportunity cost of agricultural production, a weighted average of what's currently in place in the landscape as assumed to be sort of taking hold in the new area that would be deforested, and the profitability of those extrapolated in as well. I'm going to just sort of run through how this stacks up, and attempting to be a little bit dramatic by adding one and then the other, but that's not logical. It doesn't have any sort of time sequence to it. It's just sort of to visualize how it lays out. Starting by just adding in one ecosystem service to what you'd otherwise think of as the sort of market values of the land, timber and ag, you get this straightforward sort of result that carbon value exceeds, that with carbon value, the green scenario exceeds the value of the business as usual scenario. If you add back in management cost, business as usual starts to win. And if you add back in this somewhat undefined bundle of good things that people perceive as coming from these protected areas, as based on a willingness to pay study, again, green looks like a good choice for this region. Maybe the interesting bit is to sort of bring out some of the complexities in doing this, even though that looks sort of straightforward. One of them would be to note that management cost, while it's a cost, is also something that benefits the local economy. Some of it, maybe most of it, not all perhaps, goes to hire local people, goes to buy stuff from the local economy. And so it has to sort of appear in both columns. Another interesting thing to consider is that local value from agriculture may be actually closer to the gross return than the profit. That is, the standard assumption would be to say the value of ag is the profit. These guys earn this much, the rest is their cost. But in fact, again, many of those costs happen locally. Those guys are buying their inputs locally, they're hiring people locally to work on the farm and so on, and that suggests that those values should go up as you try to do a better job of this analysis. This third point is a key one, and one that has sort of repercussions throughout this, but that the negative welfare impact of carbon emissions is much, much higher than what ends up being monetized in what sort of exists already in the voluntary market. That is, the cost to society of each ton of carbon is much more than what's being paid now per ton. And if you go with inflated estimates from the Stern report, it's something like $35 per ton rather than $7, or DEFRA, I think, has a similar number. And that's important because that's a difference in what society gets versus what gets locally, even if a transaction happens, which isn't happening in most cases. And finally, an error in this work that's worth noting is that, I go backwards. If you look at the carbon bar, which is the green one, there is in fact carbon in the ag landscape too. And so that sort of principle of making sure that you dealt with ecosystem services in both landscapes was violated here. But anyway, that's in the interest of transparency. So just to show two more sort of graphs of this, if you start to add in some of those considerations from a local point of view, you get a different comparison if you add in, for example, the increased actual local value of economic activity from ag and from payment and management. Thing looks only marginally positive. And that, again, is only if someone's paying the carbon. If no one pays, that's a theoretical value. It's a value, the world would get it, but the cost benefit at this scale is negative. And going to the global scale, you take, instead of $7 per ton, 35 per ton, and this thing becomes whoppingly positive. Carbon is sort of everyone's favorite elephant in the room now, and this is probably partly why. This plus a nascent market. And you get a project that looks like it has quite a large positive impact. Again, the challenge is getting the beneficiaries of these things that are global to help share some of that locally. And this is a point that I won't get into, but discount rates obviously are quite relevant to these things as well. Just to give one more example sort of on the information side, this is some work done by colleagues in the science unit at CI as well. And what these guys did was to look at, across, I think maybe 4 or 5 countries, people in and around marine protected areas and ask a couple of questions related to their well-being. In particular, what their income was and how diverse their income was, and something about perception as well that I won't talk about. But what these guys found was if you take people around protected areas, in and around protected areas, and far from protected areas, the guys, women, the people near protected areas ended up fairly constantly and with a good confidence interval, a good level of confidence, having a higher income and having a more diverse income. That isn't something that helps you decide anything beforehand in that place, but it's a lesson from one place that's applicable perhaps to others. And I would just note that again, in the interest of sort of transparency here, the full-blown matching, I haven't gotten into that yet. Oh, the sort of full-blown matching model that Kwa Endam and other people have used, for example, in Costa Rica, of picking really matching people in terms of access, in terms of condition of the resource beforehand, wasn't done here. So there are potentially some methodological points too. Again, more to illustrate what I think is a strong finding, more to illustrate a methodology than the actual truth. Okay, so in summary then about information. Improved information can, among other things, suggest or provide inputs into where and if protected areas actually make sense. And it can also inform management strategies along the lines of how to make protected areas more attractive to decision makers. One way to do that is through understanding trade-offs. That is, who's giving up what as you take different management strategies. Local use may be really important, and if you manage in a strict way, that goes. That's something to understand in a sort of an intentional economic way. And if there are things like carbon that are a big piece of the value, understanding the market failure at play there and the need to correct that as well if you want to make conservation attractive locally. Better information can also sort of inspire management to maximize benefits and minimize costs. There are things that can be done, for example, to deal with crop rating that are relatively low cost and have a huge impact as far as both the costs felt locally and probably ultimately the effectiveness of areas based on better relationships with people. Similarly, in regard to local benefits, understanding sustainable local use can be a big driver of permitting it. Again, possibility of retaining important benefits. Important to note here is that these are often logistical challenges. This isn't to say that sort of simple economics should prevail in management strategies, but it's good information as an input. And finally, there are a lot of people that may or may not be moved by saying this protected area system, this investment is a good idea, but clearly that's the one audience for this kind of thing. The second area of market failure that I wanted to talk about is this issue of land and resource rights. And I'll really only talk about the second point here. But I would note that enforcement is really key here. Protected areas are like any sort of property. If you can't manage them effectively, you get an irresponsible sort of a use over the long term. And I think that the point I wanted to bring out is that while that's often seen as something that's against local people's best interest, I think there's a huge role for improving enforcement in tackling elites of society, whether those are sort of privileged logging companies that know someone in the police, or big fishing outfits that can set nets in places where other people aren't allowed to, that actually destroy resources that local people might otherwise use sustainably. So I think I wanted to flag the utility of enforcement as a means to preserve the long-term flow of benefits from protected areas, as with any sort of form of property. And the point that I'll go into in a little bit of detail is this issue of recognition of local rights and real participation, and in particular, the possibility that can both help create new kinds of protected areas that serve multiple goals, and also the possibility that it can help design more effective sets of protected areas, or landscapes, in fact, that have a more effective integration of different goals in them. And I'll talk very quickly through two examples here. The first is, and this is one of a lot of things kind of like this, is the Southern Guyana Community-Owned Conservation Area, which is called a COCA. And that, in very simple terms, is a 600,000 hectare community-owned, community-declared, community-designed protected area, which sits in a country that has a very nascent, if protected area system, if it could be called one at all, and it functions. It's a real thing. Provides a model for further community protected areas. And the point to bring out here is, according to the vision statement articulated by these guys, with help, technical support as they needed it, was that this is a protected area that has multiple goals. It serves multiple purposes. And it comes about from recognizing rights and including them in sort of the structure of protected area design. I won't read it, and I certainly won't read the foreign language at the top. The second example I'll give you is actually also not from a particular protected area. It's actually from a pulp concession in Indonesia. And it's one in which the company that has the concession should get credit here. This is a Medco company, and they sort of chose to do this way beyond what the law at least was requiring them to do. And in particular, what they tried to do, and what we worked with them on, was to balance production, ecosystem services, and socio-cultural priorities in their concession. This was quite a sort of a data-heavy exercise, and so the people involved started by generating information on ecological representation. They worked to generate information on hydrology, and the reason this is important is because this landscape floods, and that has everything to do with what's culturally important and where production is viable. Culminating in flood mapping, They worked on production suitability, and the interesting thing here is that you can model out across these landscapes where production might be most important. And there are places in this landscape that aren't good for production, and that's important to know too. And they worked on community priorities, and it's always fun to show sort of community priority maps, and I resisted the temptation to do that. But the idea here too is that there's quite a heavy process of consultation to understand what communities use for what, where, and why, and what they've envisioned as their own sort of future use of this area. And the really sort of useful part of this, I think, is that clearly you can't take a bunch of data layers and just kind of slap them on top of each other and have the right answer come out the end. You need to work on some way to integrate that stuff and integrate what are, in effect, multiple objectives for the same landscape. And so the decision hierarchy in this case is interesting in that it represents objectives from all the different perspectives. So from biodiversity representation point of view, the idea was to meet ecological representation targets and maintain hydrological function. This idea of minimizing shape within spatial characteristics had to do with not having things that were sort of long and snaky, and minimize the number of individual tiny protected spots. From a production standpoint, simply the idea is to minimize the cells rated high for production that go into the conservation area. And from a community perspective, 3 bits. 1 is to maximize the amount of community use land. 2 is to conserve sacred sites. And 3, and this is interesting, I think, to exclude villages from the conservation area. And that was based on interest in having the jobs that would come from pulp factories. And so what you get if you do this and you go through a process of sort of multi-criteria analysis and understanding different objectives is the potential to maximize areas that are important for ecological function, representation, and community, in particular in the less productive areas. And just to explain this map a bit, this is the concession, in fact, in lots of different chunks, because that's how it was granted. With production suitability in green, high, mid-production productivity suitability in yellow, and low suitability in blue. And going through this process came up with a protected area system that looks like this. That is the areas in black, and you probably can't tell, but I'll sort of toggle back and forth. What in fact happened was that the generation of a map of potential protected areas that really was by and large on the low production areas, so much so that the company is willing now to explore even more conservation area. Again, an opportunity to include local perspectives in the design. And I can talk more about that too, among other things as I go along. Anyway, so in summary about this point, addressing rights and participation can, among other things, provide at least a foundation for addressing equity. Again, sort of have input into where and if protected areas are a good choice and for whom they should be a good choice. They can inform management strategies, great potential sort of for synergy in management strategies, I think. They can open the door to multiple types of protected areas being created with multiple objectives, and I think that they importantly also can simply improve the delivery of services through improved effectiveness, better community relationships, not cutting people off from key sources of income and things like that. And this isn't all sort of a bed of roses, obviously, when you get down to it, but there's potential for this to work and to be important. The final sort of market failure I'll talk about a bit is again the issue of externalities and public goods, and I think the challenge here is a simple one in theory and a hard nut to crack in reality. And it is to increase the share of costs paid by beneficiaries. And you can do that at every scale, from local to global, theoretically. And these are some of the possible ways to do it. And critically also to make sure that the people that are in a position to choose to provide or not those positive externalities get some of the incentive to do it. And it's important to disaggregate that. That is, it's not enough to, for example, make a red payment to Peru and be done. It may be, as long as the government of Peru is allocating that money to the right sort of incentive structure to its people. It's not purely a question of the government of Peru's incentive. And that's not to single out Peru. That's a constant thing, to make sure that the particular people bearing the costs, the particular people with a choice between deforestation and not, get to share in the benefits of not doing it. I'll illustrate this with one case, well, with 2 cases, but one is fairly simple. This one is a case from Kenya. It's work done by a couple of partners. And it's one actually that Pavan is involved in and can talk about if that's useful. This is a context that's trying to conserve lions, water, and forest. And the sort of basic dynamic here is that people are herders in this landscape, and lions traditionally are a net cost to people. They kill livestock, and they provide relatively little benefit. Communities have not traditionally shared very much in tourism benefit, and that's what lions might be good for. So the sort of generic starting point in this landscape might be something like this. That is, although conservation is attractive globally, it isn't locally. And the reason is because the majority of what happens locally is this cost of lying, killing livestock, and people don't share in very many of the benefits. At the national scale, there's important benefits in tourism, there's important benefits in water, and some costs perhaps paid in protected area management. And at the global scale, there are things like the existence of lions and these amazing landscapes around Kilimanjaro that have a value. But again, at that scale, there's almost no sharing of cost. So what these guys are doing is starting to address some of the market failures that relate to that benefit and cost distribution. And in particular, two have been what they've worked on traditionally. One of them is tourism practices, working to hire more people, to pay better wages. And that's something that increases their cost and increases the benefit locally. The other thing they've been working on is trying to capture some of the global interest in the existence of this landscape, people, animals, Kilimanjaro, all of that stuff, and get it in a very concrete form to local people. And the way they've been doing that is through supporting this thing called predator compensation. That's in effect an insurance scheme for local people, so that if their livestock are killed, they get by a lion, they can receive the value of the livestock killed. As long as no one's been killing lions. Sort of a straightforward arrangement, but one that gets the incentive to the right place. And again, these are hypothetical numbers. The sort of balance may be different at the local scale with this intervention alone, but this is mostly to illustrate the point. What's going on now is an attempt to add other things into that mix, in particular to add the benefit that's felt in parts of the country from water protected by this area, and potentially get them to pay. If they can pay, the national actors will increase their cost, or the water users in particular. The local benefit will go up again, and potentially to get some of the carbon market, everyone's dream again, to provide some benefit nationally and some locally. And the story is sort of the straightforward one, right? If all of these things come together, or if some set of them do, conservation becomes attractive locally, which it already is, even without some of these things, but there's some sustainability challenges. And as a result, people choose not to degrade the ecosystem, they choose not to poison lions, which is a ridiculously easy thing to do. And as a result, everybody's better off. People investing in the public good got the public good to be conserved, and again, sort of standard economics prevails. Everyone ends up better off. The sort of last example I'll give about this is from Peru, and it's in fact sort of an attempt to deal with multiple market failures in one place. This is an example from the Alto Mayo Protected Forest, which is this beautiful hilly area in San Martin. It's about 400,000 hectares. It's critical for biodiversity. It's also the most threatened national protected area in Peru, and that's because people live right inside of it, and there's a huge amount of pressure on its borders, and until fairly recently, not a huge commitment to protect it, or not a huge ability to protect it. And the sort of strategy to deal with that can be conceptualized and put into whatever language is right, but one way to do that might be to think of it as the various market failures that they're addressing. It is now conceived of as a RED project, as in the past been conceived of as a protected area effectiveness project or a conservation agreement project. But what's at play now is sort of first, and as the big sort of most visible thing, a RED Plus project, something funded by the Disney Corporation. And that is in effect an attempt to internalize the positive externality of avoided emissions, to get the local people that would emit to share the benefit of not emitting, and to change their decision making that way. The second bit of this is to provide technical support for sustainable coffee and other agriculture potentially. And there are possibly two market failures at play there. One is both information failures. One is the simple failure of good technical information to get to people. That's not an environmental failure, just a failure. There are good things to do that are kind of neutral for the environment, but much better for production. And the other, and this is one we're investigating, is whether consumers are going to be willing to pay more for San Martin's coffee if they know it's not deforesting places like the Alto Mayo. The third area here is to improve governance and law enforcement. That's an issue of dealing with property rights. The government hasn't traditionally been able to enforce its property rights. That results in the classic problem of some people, the less law-abiding perhaps, not always, moving into this area and trafficking in land. That's at the cost to the whole population of that region. And finally, the issue of conservation agreements, which is where this was before RED came onto the scene. And those are quite simply a mechanism in which, a quid pro quo mechanism in which we offer, we in this case, honestly we, have been offering some benefit in exchange for a community making some commitment to conservation. In this case, a commitment not to clear in exchange for technical support for agriculture. That is basically just a contract mechanism to ensure a quid pro quo with communities and channel sort of whatever public good payment is available. We've done those for water. which is less of a public good. And mostly we've been trying to capture individuals or foundations that represent individuals that benefit from the existence of biodiversity. And as I mentioned, that's a sort of a sustainability challenge on top of everything else. So in summary then, addressing externalities and public goods problems can, I think, basically do this, a simple thing, if you could get it to happen, which would be to make conservation attractive to decision makers where it would be in the public good, but it isn't now in their local interest. And if you do that, you will undoubtedly increase area under protection, you'll improve management, you'll address some equity issues. But to make it happen, obviously, you have to crack the same nut of public goods problems that, that are the definition of why they don't get solved in the first place. I'm going to just take a deep breath for a second. This is the last part. Okay, so I thought I'd just sort of close by offering some final thoughts of two kinds. One a bit more general, and that is, I think as we think about using these sorts of tools, it's very important to be honest about the generation of economic arguments for protected areas. I think the world, especially in the wake of TEEB, is quite open to this sort of stuff, but at least in many of the developing countries, the quality of data available is pretty poor, and people are willing to accept fairly rough analysis. And in particular, for example, that issue of total benefit versus marginal benefit is one that often gets confused. And so I think it's quite important to be clear about what we're producing and be clear about it to decision makers, even if it's a bit more complex, because otherwise I think things are going to come around and bite us, and we'll be accused of sort of snake oil sales over time. And I think that's a mistake. And there are real human consequences to selling that snake oil if it's not true. The second issue is somewhat obviously to consider rights and distribution issues and site and management choices. There's a huge scale for just understanding this thing, or a huge scope for doing that to inform site choices, for example. The third point would be to make sure to look across the full suite of market failures. That classic example of assuming that information is the answer, but really it being a problem of not having people paying for what they're sharing in the benefit of. Is an area that continues to go on. There's a huge efforts devoted to information without understanding what degree of the problem that actually is in a given place. And so I would say in particular, it's key to be aware of what incentives are at play in the landscapes we're dealing with. And that's a distribution question among others. And the final point in this bit, I think, and this might almost be the foundation of this all, is to keep an eye out for cases where the public good isn't the objective of decision makers. So all of these sort of generate arguments that say, if you created this protected area here and somebody shared a benefit with somebody else and you manage this way, society would be better off. The local people would have a better livelihood, the country would protect its natural heritage, and the world would gain some carbon. But very often, maybe everywhere, that isn't how decision makers are making their decisions. They're making decisions based on who their friends are, based on their sort of worldview, based on constituencies, and all of those things. The classic example of this being the massive amount of subsidies that go in all sorts of funny directions that clearly aren't in the public good, and are bad investments of scarce government money, but they happen anyway. So it's good, I think, as we think about sort of choosing to generate economic arguments, to understand who we think we're going to influence and whether they're going to care, because there are quite a lot of places where we could waste some good bullets going down this path. The second sort of bit of the final thoughts here is to talk a bit about my sort of take on what might be some priority areas for technical work going forward. I think one of the key areas here is somewhat obviously to work in this area of rigorous cost-benefit analysis. That is, what would be the marginal increase or decrease in service flow if we spent a marginal amount more or less in what kind of protected area management, and what would be the change in the other kinds of values coming from that area if we did that. That kind of nuanced and high-quality analysis is very scarce. There are probably, maybe you guys know more the current sort of state of this than I do, but there are probably 10 studies that have done that. And that's not nearly enough to make any sort of general conclusion. It's not one per country. It's not sort of representative of different biomes. And it's an area in which I think rigor in making this kind of argument is really needed, and it would add to the sort of rigor overall of our ability to say these sorts of things. The second point is I think that the sort of expression of a lot of this stuff, addressing market failures in particular, can find itself in trying to roll out multiple sort of coordinated interventions in a particular landscape, or perhaps an economic sector. And what I mean by that is generating enough technical input to understand where we might put protected areas, how we might manage them, so that service flows, for example, go downstream to people who pay the people upstream, and we think about where we're going to support what kind of viable economic activity so that people are or are not drawn near the protected area, and various sort of flows of payment go to make the incentive structure work. And that sort of landscape level planning, including the protected area component, requires a technical basis to start and also to manage over time. A third thing would be to try to crack this problem of sort of increasing cost sharing on existence value in particular, but on public goods. That's something we've played around with. We've made some progress, and so have others. The carbon market certainly is a fantastic and intriguing possibility if it emerges for one of those values, but existence has always and continues to plague conservation groups. Something in which it's obvious that increased global spending makes a ton of sense, and in which increased global spending for things like recurring management have not materialized. The fourth area here would be to think about how we can integrate this into the green economy movement. I think that there's a huge role for thinking about market failure as one of the sort of addressing market failure as one of the sort of hallmarks of why a green economy might make sense. And finally, and this is sort of a caveat like the one on the first of these slides, the history, the documented history with good data of better information or better flows of payments changing behavior is poorly understood. And we're certainly in sort of new territory in thinking about how we can roll out really good economic analyses like these to change behavior, about resources to change behavior within protected areas and what that will do to service flow change, what that will do to service flows. And so I would say that as we do this, there's a great role for simply being conscious of how we test hypotheses and how we learn from what we're doing. And that too is an area for technical work, I think. And that's the end. So I think the idea is that there will be questions now. I'm happy to answer whatever ones have come up. Thanks.